Wise Child by Monica Furlong, Chapter 2, The White House. It was a long way to Juniper's house. We passed along the side of a field full of ripe barley, and across another field, and through a gate, and over a stream by a plank bridge. Later, that bridge was to terrify me, but I was too frightened of Juniper at the moment to have fear to spare for the narrow plank and the rushing water. I was sniffing back the tears. Juniper did not mention my tears, but I did not feel that she ignored them either. She just walked along, occasionally speaking to Tilly and sometimes humming a little tune to herself. It was raining again, and I could feel the wet squidging horribly in my shoes. Miserably, I knew that the brown leather would stain my lovely stockings, and I wept again because of that. I walked more and more slowly, but this time Juniper did not suggest that I ride on Tilly's back. The track had started to wind very steeply uphill. It seemed unfair that I had to puff and pant as well as cry. The two of us labored up the track. Juniper had stopped humming now. Toward a white house with stone walls. I had always lived in a little round house made of timber and mud. Nearly everyone I knew except Juniper lived in that sort of house. "Stop a minute," said Juniper. "It's misty today, but it's a wonderful view." There was the village with all its little beehive-shaped houses and gardens, and the barns and fields in different colors, and the big ditch beyond that, and the palisades that were built to keep away the foreign devils, and then farther away the blue heath and the shore and the sea, and the distant islands, and beyond that the mountains whose peaks were in sunlight. It was a glorious sight. In the village itself there were tiny ant-like figures of people. "Nearly home," said Juniper. We reached the lip of the cliff and passed over it. We were on the roof of the world now. The white house was very close, bigger even than I remembered it. We passed through a gate, through a wilderness of flowers. Nobody grew flowers, just things to eat. Then we went up some shallow steps and in at the door. My heart was beating very fast, so it was quite hard to breathe. My first feeling was one of space. It was the biggest room I had ever seen, with a flight of stairs leaving it from one corner. In the middle was the great hearth, and although it was August, there was already a fire burning there that filled the house with the comforting smell of peat. Around the fireplace was a kind of step with cushions upon it, and there were two huge cats already sitting there, just as the children had said there would be. Seeing me look at them, Juniper introduced them. "This is Pearl," she said, waving her hand at the white cat. "And this is Ruby," indicating the gray one. Both cats looked up as if they were curious about me, and then stared straight in front of them again. "Why Ruby?" I asked, speaking for the first time since leaving the village. "She's not red." "It's her eyes," said Juniper. "They glow in the dark like rubies. Besides, I love rubies." In front of the fireplace was a carved chair where I knew Juniper must sit, and beside it was a small chair with a green cushion. "That is for you," said Juniper. "For me?" "I was expecting you." I sat down in the chair, and Juniper started unfastening my wet shoes and easing off my stockings. "How fine your stockings are," she said admiringly. In the village we never praised another's possessions, still less their children or their animals, for fear of attracting the evil eye. Her praise did seem odd. Then she helped me pull off the clammy dress that I hated and wrapped a soft blanket around me. I sat in my green chair, which was very comfortable, and Juniper brought me a hot drink. I remembered about the honey drink that made you see everything differently. "What's in it?" I asked suspiciously, thinking, I'll have to eat and drink sometime. "It's tea," said Juniper. "One I drink on special occasions, made of my very best herbs." I sipped it carefully, waiting for it to make me feel funny and ill, but it tasted so delicious, and I had been feeling so cold that I could not stop drinking it. It was sweet without being cloying, and fragrant like flowers. I was tempted to ask for more, but I did not want to give her any encouragement. I began to feel relaxed and sleepy, but in order not to doze off, I studied the room, in particular the floor covering. I had never seen any covering on a floor except rushes and herbs. But I knew that this was a carpet. It had interesting beasts on it, beasts that I would like to see for myself one day. Juniper told me what they were. A Leontosaurus, which is a bigger and fiercer sort of lion, a griffin, a dragon, and a big winged lizard. Over the fireplace, facing toward the village, was a round mirror. On the other side of the room was a huge table set on a flagged floor. There were shelves around it that held cooking pots and earthenware jars, and vats that I later discovered held liquids the color of straw, or pond green, or dingy black, or the brilliant hue of Juniper's ruby ring. There was a big sideboard with earthenware pitchers and plates on it, and a huge pestle and mortar. From the ceiling hung bunches of plants, some of them wrapped in muslin. Afterward, I was to discover that if you went through a door behind the table, you came out into a cool dairy that ran along the back of the house. It too had a flagged floor, white walls and marble tables, with tubs and churns and jugs and strainers, and newly scalded cloths hung up to dry. In one corner was a quern, in which I would laboriously grind our meal. Presently I got dressed again in my brown smock, a dry pair of stockings, and the leather slippers Finbar had brought for me on one of his travels. "I bet Finbar gave you those," said Juniper, rather impertinently, I thought, so I did not reply. Then she said she must go and milk the cow, and I, if I wished, might explore her house. As she spoke, I began imagining the ghosts and dead babies in the cabinets and in the attic, but I said nothing. It seemed safest to let her think that I was stupider than I was. When she was gone, I wandered around the big room, looking at stones and bits of glass Juniper had collected, at a game of finchnel with glass pieces laid out on a board. There was a flute lying on a piece of velvet on a chair, a big harp standing in the corner, and a lute resting against the wall. There was a distaff half covered with thread, with a puff of wool beside it. These did not interest me as much as some strange cards laid out in a row on a table. The cards had pictures of kings and queens, of clowns and soldiers and ladies, of someone hanging on a gibbet like I had seen once on a visit to the town of Salem. I played with the cards for a bit, and then I could not remember the original order, but I thought that Juniper would probably not notice anyway. I was fascinated that Juniper owned books, a whole row of them on a shelf. Philin was the only person I knew who had books, and he only had one or two. I took one of them down, holding it carefully, pressing the squeaking covers back on the table, and I saw that it was about stars, with pictures of people and animals drawn around the stars in the sky. I knew a lot about stars, and I thought I would enjoy studying the book later. I put it back on its shelf. There were books of spells, too. In a way, I longed to be able to do spells. It seemed very exciting, but I was also frightened that Juniper would do a spell against me, and I didn't like that idea at all. I turned to the staircase. It was very remarkable. At the bottom of the stairs and halfway up, and again at the top, the carpenter had used the stair posts to carve flowers, poppies and pinks and roses and convolvulus. And along the banisters he had carved animals, gentle deer and lambs, and dogs and lions. I thought it was the most interesting staircase I had ever seen, though I had not seen many. Beside the staircase, an enormous window of greeny leaded glass looked sideways over the village and past it to the sea, and the window was curtained in a silky fabric of forest green, with touches of red and blue gleaming in it like metal. And once again the motif of poppies and roses and pinks and convolvulus was repeated. I touched the curtains with reverence. They were so beautiful. There was a thick carpet on the stairs, and it led my feet up to another floor with doors opening off it. The doors were closed, and it was frightening to open them. However, my curiosity was too great for me to resist, and I discovered that there were 2 big bedrooms, each with a carved bed and a white cover on the bed. Each had big dark cabinets. Remembering what Seamus had said, I shuddered. One of the rooms had another tiny room opening off it, almost like a cupboard, just big enough to hold a small bed, with a pretty rag rug beside it. It was a cozy little place, a nest with the walls painted in orange flowers. Another small staircase led upward from this floor. I climbed up a few steps, knowing that this must lead to the attic. I could see the small white door at the top, with a beautiful ivory handle. I was so sure that this door must be locked that I could not resist trying it. But to my surprise, it opened half an inch. My heart began to beat very fast as I decided to explore further. But just then I heard Juniper's step downstairs. I shut the door quickly and ran softly down the wooden staircase and back down the carpeted one. Juniper smiled at me. "Do you like my house?" she wanted to know. "It's pretty," I said coldly. "Hungry?" she asked. I was hungry, but I was fearful too. Suppose she put magic in the food. It was a terrible dilemma. I decided to let her know that I suspected her. "Seamus said you might make spells in the food," I mumbled. I blushed as soon as I had said it and looked away from her. There was a moment's silence, and suddenly I was terror-stricken. Now the kindly mask would fall off, and I would see the witch as she really was, wicked and cruel and out to get me in her power. But to my amazement she laughed, a big gurgling laugh that was irresistibly jolly. "Why don't you come and help me prepare supper, and then you can see whether I put any spells on it. Then, if we both eat the same things, will that make you feel safer?" I nodded again, embarrassed now, and went with her into the dairy to cut the peppered cheese and to pour the foaming yellow milk. We supped off that and big slices of dark bread, and there was wallflower dark honey, and some sweet blueberry mess that I liked particularly. Juniper was meticulous about dividing every dish, or slice, in half, which annoyed me rather, since I had begun to feel silly about my fears. But I was terribly hungry. I had eaten very little in the previous 24 hours, and for the last months of my grandmother's life, I had survived mostly on oatcakes and porridge. Nature was too much for me. I simply gave up worrying about spells and so enjoyed my meal very much. I know a spell, I told Juniper when my hunger was somewhat appeased. I didn't want her to think she was the only one who knew magic. Well, it's more of a charm, really, for the toothache. Niall taught it to me. That boy with the sad eyes who lives in the house opposite the church? I was to be astonished at how carefully Juniper had observed us all. I'll tell you if you like. I could never resist any chance to recite, so I plunged at once into the charm. Peter sat weeping on a marble stone. Jesus came and said, "What aileth thee, Peter?" He answereth and said, "My Lord and my God. He that can say this, and believeth it for my sake, never more shall have the toothache." I finished this with a fine dramatic flourish. "Well," said Juniper, "does it work?" "I'm not sure," I said truthfully. "I only had half a toothache once, and I had a feeling it was about to get better anyway." "Toothache is a difficult one," Juniper admitted, as one magician to another. "I expect I'd have some other ideas if I racked my brains. Chamomile might help a bit. Now I must go and shut up the chickens. There's a wicked old fox on the prowl. Perhaps you could wash the plates?" I did not want to admit that I was the only girl in those parts who had never washed plates, that I had always left it all to my grandmother. So, although I hated doing those sorts of jobs, I lifted the big water jug that stood in a sink near the table and poured some water into a bowl. I used a sort of scratchy twig thing to take the stickiness off the plates. Luckily, they were not very dirty. Then I found the cloth and dried them. And although a little of the stickiness came off on the cloth and made it dirty, I more or less got it done. Juniper, meanwhile, had come back bearing an armful of driftwood, and quite soon the salty flames began twisting green and blue around the wood. It was lovely to watch. "Would you like me to tell you a story?" Juniper asked. "I'm a good storyteller." I said nothing, feeling that the distance between us had become much too narrow over supper. I had even told her what I knew about the stars, how my father used to take me out at night and hold me on his shoulder to teach me the names of the planets, and how in the summer sometimes we would lie out at night on the hill with a blanket or two and watch the great constellations wheel about us. I would fall asleep and wake up and find that Orion, my favorite, had moved toward the horizon and that other stars were looking down on me. Suddenly I wanted Finbar very badly. As if Juniper could read my mind, she said very quietly, "He will be back, wise child, in a while. Meanwhile, you will have to make do with me." Without further speech, she picked up the lute, tuned it, and began to sing me a song about 3 knights. One wore red, one wore green, and one wore yellow. The chorus went, "Oh, the red, the green, and the yellow." There was also a bit that went, "The harp, the lute, the pipe, the flute, the cymbal, sweet is the treble violin." It all made such an impression on me that I still catch myself singing it from time to time, although Juniper never sang it again after that night. All 3 of the knights went on a quest, but only the yellow knight was lucky and won the lady, probably because he was the nicest of them all. I liked it very much. Then Juniper told me a story about a juggler who got cleverer and cleverer and cleverer, and learned to juggle with more and more balls, and got more and more conceited with each ball he took on, until one day he juggled in front of the emperor and dropped the whole lot. It was really very funny, seeing how conceited the juggler was from looking at the proud expression on Juniper's face, and then how crestfallen he was after the catastrophe. But she went on to explain how the kitchen maid, who had always loved him, and whom he had thought beneath him, came and comforted him. For the first time he truly appreciated her and realized he loved her. "I can teach you how to juggle if you like," Juniper said. "Not as many balls as the juggler in the story, 3 or 4 perhaps." She had some wormy apples in a basket, windfalls that had come down before the crop was ripe, and she showed me what to do. "The trick," she said, "is getting the rhythm right. Da-da, 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 like that. You throw the apple up with your left hand, and just as it is coming to the top of its flight, you throw the next apple from right to left." Even with this advice, I couldn't do it, and I kept dropping the apples and giggling and trying again. Juniper wasn't very good at it either, though she was better than I was. I forgot all about her being a witch, and was laughing and bouncing apples off the furniture, until suddenly one fell on the cards. Immediately Juniper stopped laughing and became very serious indeed. "You've changed the cards," she said. I knew that she was going to be angry with me now, and I hung my head. "I'm sorry. They were there, and I played with them," I said. "I think I would have lied if I had thought I could get away with it." "Oh, that doesn't matter," Juniper said. "It is just what you have done with the cards that I am interested in." "I was just playing around," I said wretchedly. "Playing around is what people do with those cards. Then you look at the pattern and see what it tells you." "It doesn't tell me anything," I said, looking doubtfully at the jumble of cards. "It tells me something, though." "What?" "That this is the right place for you. I thought it was." It was growing dark now, and Juniper took a long taper from the shelf over the hearth, touched it to the fire, and lit a small candlestick, also standing on the shelf. As she straightened herself from this task and handed me the candle, she suddenly looked strange in the firelight, unnaturally tall and a little fierce. At the same time, I was aware of the darkness waiting for me at the top of the stairs. I turned away from her, ashamed to tell her that a big girl like me was frightened of the dark, and still more frightened of whatever it was she might have hidden in her dark cabinets. I wanted Aunt Morag and the children and the village and all the things and people that I was used to. My feet moved very slowly up the staircase, and the shadow of the candle danced mockingly on the wall. My hand slid around the doorknob of the big room on the right, and I slipped through the door, feeling very tiny in the vastness of the room. I put the candle down beside the bed, took off my smock, and dropped it on the floor. I thought I had better not walk too close to the bed, lest a hand should come out and grab my ankle. So I took a running jump at the bed, which gave a little squeal as I landed on it. I pulled the blankets and sheets close. If I had not been so scared, I would have admired the fineness of the sheets. But my attention was on the way the candlelight flickered over the walls and up into the high ceiling. Over one cabinet was a big dark hole, and straining my eyes to see into the shadow, I could see a face, with a blunt nose and a big chin looking out of it. Perhaps if I blew out my candle, it would think that I had gone away. I knew that magic creatures were easily deceived. I half sat up and blew out the candle, and then with a little moan lay back down and pulled the sheets and blankets over my head. Now, however, the darkness seemed sort of creaky, and I thought I could hear breathing. When I put my head on the pillow, I could hear a steady thump, 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 and I imagined a monster walking up and down the passage outside my door. He had a body like a man, but a head like a pig. It was worse with the candle out than it had been when it was alight. The darkness felt heavy and stuffy, as if it was pressing the breath out of me. I began to cry, with tiny, quiet sobs at first, and then with big, noisy ones. Just then the door opened and Juniper came in, carrying a lamp, which she held up high. "Why, wise child," she said. She came and sat down on the bed, and suddenly the room seemed much more cheerful, as she filled it with her warm presence. "What is it?" I thought of all the things that had scared me. "I'm frightened," I wailed. "What of?" asked Juniper, who, I was later to discover, always liked to know the details of things. Without stopping to think, as if I was talking to some other person altogether, I told Juniper, between sobs, how my cousins had said that her cabinets were full of ghosts or bodies, about how she flew on her broomstick, and about the jewel cave, and about the honey drink that made you see everything differently. I heaved a great sobbing sigh when I got to the end, and I felt a lot better. She had listened carefully to all of it. "That would be enough to frighten anyone," she said warmly. "I think you've been very brave with all that to worry about. As for the cabinets, they are full of very boring things, you know. We'll look at them by daylight and you can see for yourself. For the rest, there are things about the way I live that are different from the life you are used to, but I think you will rather like it when you get used to it." "You mean there isn't any magic or spells or anything of that sort?" I said, immediately disappointed now that my fear had subsided. "I didn't say that. It's just that magic gets quite ordinary when you live with it, you know. You'll soon see." There was a silence between us for a little, and then she said, "You know, this room is much too big for you, wise child. You will rattle around in it like a hailstone on a roof. In my bedroom there is a tiny room with a little bed in it, just the right size for you, and now that you know that there is no need to be frightened of me, it will be just right for you. Would you like to sleep in there?" I nodded. It sounded lovely. Juniper wrapped a quilt around me, lifted me up in her arms as she had done those years before on the road, and carried me out of the frightening room, across the passage, and to the little bed in the tiny room with the orange flowers. She tucked the bedclothes in around me. Suddenly I felt wonderfully warm and cozy and terribly sleepy. Whatever the horrors of the house, they seemed to have nothing to do with me now. Later I half woke to hear Juniper quietly breathing in her part of the room. She wasn't out on her broomstick then. And that made me feel glad and safe. When I next woke up, the sunshine was brilliant on the orange flowers. The sky was blue and I could hear birds singing. I jumped out of bed onto the bright rag rug, pulled on my brown smock. There was no sign of the black dress, and I was not sorry. And I ran barefoot down the stairs, curious to see what Juniper would do or say today.